Welcome everyone to the first ever, I guess, live event. We call this a live recording because we've typically done these as podcasts, and we decided to open this up to our membership and to the general public to kind of listen into these live so that we can have more audience interaction. So welcome everyone to the first live version of the Project Liberal podcast. My name is Josh Eckel. I'm the president of Project Liberal and the co-founder. I'm joined today by Max Marty from our steering committee. Good afternoon, Max. And yeah, absolutely. And we've got Jeremiah Johnson from the Center for New Liberalism here as well. Jeremiah, thank you for taking some time to join us.
Absolutely. It's great to be here.
Yeah, so before we jump into it, I just wanted to do a 60-second brief for our audience as to why we started this project, why we're here, and maybe give some context on what Project Liberal is, and maybe why we've got Jeremiah on the show, why we're talking about the topic we're talking about. So I'm going to jump into that briefly, spend about 60 seconds, and then we'll jump into the meat of the conversation. Assuming, there we go. So we'll do a quick screen share. So everyone, Project Liberal is a nonprofit organization that was founded to defend and promote liberal values. The reason we started this project is because we believe that authoritarianism is on the rise and threatening our institutions in the United States. We're seeing a very disturbing convergence of the far left and the far right. And they're really united against the basic concept of liberal democracy. We're seeing this play out in a variety of different ways. You see kind of both these extremes embracing isolationism, protectionism, praise of foreign dictators, restrictions on freedom and individual liberty. And we believe that liberalism is the antidote to authoritarianism. Every great thing that the United States has accomplished as a society has been due to her embrace of liberal values and her liberal tradition. And so to that end, we're trying to cultivate an ascendant liberal identity online. We're trying to bring together liberals across different political and ideological camps. And really the goal is, because we believe we're in the middle of a political realignment, to unite liberals across all political parties, subsets of American life, to bring them together to basically rally around the defense of liberal democracy and the values that made America great. So with that said, we've got Jeremiah here. Jeremiah, thank you for taking the time to chat with us. Today, we're going to talk a bit about, first, I think we wanted to jump into some conversation around your recent trip to the DNC. But before we do that, I was thinking it might be smart to maybe ask a big picture question around what does liberalism mean to you, and kind of how do you relate to it personally from an ideological perspective? What are your inspirations that maybe make you consider yourself part of that ideological tradition?
Yeah, and thanks for having me, Josh. And Project Liberal is something I'm super interested in. I really hope you guys succeed, because God knows we need more organizations kind of pushing in this direction. I think of liberalism in a lot of ways. Like when people ask me about what does liberal mean, how do you define yourself as a liberal? It's an interesting question because the word liberal in different contexts can mean so many different things. If you're European, it normally means more you're like a center-right capitalist. If you're American, it commonly means like you're a member of the Democratic Party. You're kind of to the left. It can have like a political science meaning. It can have a philosophical meaning. And I kind of am all of the above. I would be accurately described by all of those. I'm a capitalist. I'm a Democrat. I am philosophically liberal. I take great inspiration from thinkers in the tradition of Locke, of John Stuart Mill, all kind of the great body of liberal philosophy that exists. But when I kind of, I don't know, when I think about the purpose of liberalism, like why be a liberal, I go all the way back to when liberalism was first being invented, for lack of a better word. And Europe used to not be a very peaceful place. The idea that there's a bunch of countries in Europe and they all kind of get along and just bicker over regulations on the EU floor or whatever. Europeans used to kill each other routinely all the time in really horrifying wars of religion and nationalism. And this was pretty much the dominant feature of European history for hundreds and hundreds of years. Post fall of the Roman Empire is just constant warfare, killing the next town over because they have allegiance to the wrong duke or the wrong king, or one of them's Protestant, one of them's Catholic. And I think of liberalism as kind of the agreement that we all ended up making with each other that there's a better way to resolve our differences than killing each other. And that's like a very fundamental, basic thing. But that's where liberalism grew out of. It grew out of kind of the wars of religion, 1400 to 1700 in Europe, broadly speaking, that were really, really brutal, unrelenting wars. And liberalism came in and said, hey, maybe we can just be, one of us can be Catholic, one of us can be Protestant, and we don't have to kill each other over it. We can disagree through other means, through the law or through civil society, or kind of through just debate and the open marketplace of ideas. And that's the bedrock of kind of how I think about liberalism, is that it's a technology, it's a piece of social technology that allows us to live with people who disagree with us.
Uh, real quick question on that, Jeremiah. So do you think of liberalism as tolerance for the outgroup, right? So you have you're this particular religion, and now you can tolerate being in the same society with these others? Or do you see it as kind of a no, they're not the outgroup, they're the in-group. It's just that our in-group is now more diverse. Our in-group can tolerate having these different perspectives within it. Like, how do you see that?
I think it's a little of both. What you're describing is a little bit half of, six of one, half dozen of the other. It's a semantic difference, I think, to some extent. But the way I think of it is, yes, tolerance is one of those core values of liberalism. It's philosophically kind of core to what it means to be a liberal. But I also think about, the basic human rights that really have been best expressed under liberal philosophy, the ideas of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, different economic freedoms of the market. All of those are really, really important. And they're kind of the building blocks of, like, how can we build a society where people are different than each other, but the society still thrives? Because that's something we had to figure out how to do. And it was a long, painstaking process, but it's what's gotten us to here. The last 200-300 years post, liberal philosophy are the richest and, the most explosion of economic growth, the greatest explosion of living standards and wealth and human rights compared to any other period of history. There's something we unlocked when we really started to respect those kind of values.
That makes sense. I think everything you're describing to me, though, sounds like classical liberalism. How do you then, but you're a self-described member of the Blue Tribe, so how do you then, what's the modifier that you add on to yourself that converts you from just sort of a classical liberal, or a liberal in a different sense, into a Democrat, a liberal within that specific camp?
Yeah. So it's funny you say, I am a Democrat. I work to get Democrats elected. I'm part of the Blue Tribe Borg in the United States. But when I was a teenager, the first political party that I identified with was the Libertarians. I was one of those just completely insufferable teenage libertarians. And I grew out of it at some point. But I still retain a lot of those libertarian instincts, and I think that's a good thing. I think Democrats could benefit from being a lot more libertarian, in the same way I think the Libertarian Party could benefit from being a lot less libertarian.
A lot more liberal.
Yeah, a lot more liberal in a sense. But so I think of liberalism, if you think about it philosophically, trace it all the way back hundreds of years, right? It's a tree that has many branches. And, one of those branches, classical liberalism, kind of leads into libertarianism, but it also leads into neoliberalism, social liberalism. There's all kinds of different branching paths to kind of get to particular philosophies, but they all do come back to the same core values. And the core values of classical liberalism, I still hold to pretty strongly. Now, what does that mean when it comes to, like, what should we do with welfare policy? Well, classical liberalism is not going to have an exact answer for you there, because it's just going to have a set of very abstract values, and the messy world of setting actual policy. How should we set tax rates? How should we set trade policy? What about zoning regulations? It can give you some guidelines, but you're always going to have to figure out, well, exactly what should we be doing here? And I kind of, I think of the Democratic Party as the way to best get what I want in American politics. The Democratic Party, I think, is a place where, it's not all like this, but there's an active camp of people trying to do the right thing. They're trying to, build a stronger capitalist society that still has a strong welfare state. And I don't think those two things are in conflict sometimes. Sometimes it's like, well, you can either be a capitalist or you can, like, enjoy the welfare state. And I don't see that those two things should be or need to be in conflict. I think that, there's great energy within many parts of the Democratic Party for permitting reform, which I know we're going to get into, for building more housing, for building a lot of clean energy, for more infrastructure, for occupational licensing reform, for kind of all these things that I care about, as opposed to the only other game in town, which is the Republicans, who seem to have taken an anti-immigrant, anti-trade, kind of economically illiterate viewpoint about how the world works. And so, to me, I don't think the Democratic Party is perfect, but I do think it's the best game in town right now by a pretty clear margin. To say nothing of just basic respect for democratic norms and institutions, which is, kind of been sold out on the right in favor of a cult of personality.
I want to touch on that a little bit more and dig into that, because that was one of the things that obviously the Democratic National Convention just wrapped. There's tension between people like yourself and I think Max and myself, who might be more pro-market and more about economic freedom versus these more state control, say Bernie Sanders, sock dem types or progressives. That's playing out within the Democratic coalition. Before I get into that, though, I want to remind everyone we are recording. So to answer the question that just popped up in chat, and if you have questions, throw them in the Q&A and we'll come to those at the end. We are already seeing Q&A questions, so we'll go back through those in the order that we receive them. So feel free to submit them as we go. So to that end, you wrote an article in The Unpopulist about this topic, around basically your experience at the Democratic National Convention, the fact that seems to be some unity, but there's these underlying fractures between these two different camps. So maybe the bigger question I'd ask you would, first of all, what did you feel like the energy was coming out of the convention? Did you feel like it was all unity? Maybe you could speak to kind of your personal experience there, and then kind of how you saw that maybe map into some sort of these kind of underlying coalition conflicts that you see coming down the horizon.
Yeah, it was an interesting experience being there. It was my first time at a convention, my first time at the DNC, and I would say the energy was pretty incredible. It was a really, just on a nuts and bolts level, it was a really slickly produced, really well-run event, phenomenally organized. And the energy in the room when I was there, I wasn't there every night, but the nights that I was there was phenomenal. And the sense that I got talking to people was that everybody within the Democratic coalition is really, really united for now. The threat of Trump is a great unifying factor for everyone within the Democratic coalition. There are these kind of tensions, like you mentioned, between a more statist approach, a more regulatory approach that focuses on price gouging and different, price controls. Joe Biden has proposed some sort of national rent control for corporate landlords or something like that. That kind of approach to politics, as opposed to what I would call the abundance approach, which is, we've got to build a lot more housing, we've got to build a lot of green energy, we want to build. And in order to do that, we've got to kind of sweep away some of these regulations that are stopping us from doing that, whether that's in particular environmental laws that slow everything down enormously, or whether it's zoning and other kind of methods that people use to stop people from building housing. There's one faction that is really focused on that and is really focused on unleashing the power of the market. And there's one faction that really believes the market is more villain and needs to be tamed and controlled. Um, those kind of viewpoints are not going to coexist happily together forever. There are going to be fights, but for now, it's really pretty remarkable how much Trump is a unifying factor for Democrats. That nobody is really wanting to for these fights to spill out into the open. And I think Harris has done a really good job of kind of towing the line between the two camps, trying to keep everybody happy, everybody focused on the same goal. She'll propose something like her housing plan, which uses some pretty YIMBY language and says things like, we need to build 3 million new houses on top of what's already scheduled to be built. We have a housing shortage, we need more supply. But then it also, throws in some stuff about in there. It throws in some subsidies. It throws in some language about cracking down on corporate landlords and things like that. And that's pretty clearly more in the Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders camp. I think Harris is smart to do what she's doing. And because I don't think she's an ideologue. I don't think that she has an ideological foot in either camp. I think it would be a mistake to even ask the question, what does Kamala Harris believe? What Kamala Harris believes is that she should be elected president and that she's a member of the Democratic Party. And so kind of like Joe Biden, she's going to be where the party is. Joe Biden throughout his entire career is just reliably at the center of the Democratic Party. Not necessarily the center of all American politics, but Joe Biden is always going to be at the center of the Democratic Party because he's a party guy. And I think it's probably best to understand Harris in the same way.
I have two thoughts about this that you triggered while you were saying that. The first one is this, as we talked about at the beginning of the show, I believe we're in the middle of a significant realignment. There's some crazy coalitions that are shifting. We saw this play out in the DNC with this rhetorical, as you mentioned, with Obama talking about removing regulations, this rhetorical shift, kind of what seemed like to be to the middle. It reminds me of what played out in the Republican Party in 2016 in a different way. One of the things that's been well reported since Trump was elected is once he was elected, there was this fight within his administration between these, what they'd call the globalist free traders and the isolationists. And this fight kind of played out for years on behind the scenes in the Trump administration. It turns out the isolationists won that battle. Sounds like that same thing is coming for the Democratic Party. It's going to be interesting to see how that takes shape. Do you feel like any one side has momentum? Because one of the things that I think about here is if there's a rhetorical shift to the center, it's going to attract an entire slew of Democratic voters that might be more interested in the types of narratives and the types of ideas that may kind of be a combat to the progressives, which have dominated politics for a long time. So that coalition could be downstream of the rhetorical shift. Do you have any thoughts on maybe the trajectory? And then I can hand it back to Matt.
Yeah, I mean, this is going to play out in a couple different ways. There is a rhetorical shift to the center happening, but it's happening inconsistently in different areas, I would say. You see it most clearly in kind of non-economic areas, like when, just the fact that people at the Trump rally are waving mass deportation now signs, and people at the DNC are waving USA USA signs. The DNC was interrupted by USA USA chants dozens of times, and that's something that you wouldn't historically have always expected from Democrats, especially in kind of the woke era of like the blue tribe is very concerned with historical wrongs, and the Democrats are very concerned with just Black Lives Matter and trans rights, and not to say any of these things are bad things, but it would have been very awkward to be like, you talk about all these bad things that are happening in modern America and then break into a USA chant. That's gone. The Democrats are extremely pro-patriotism. And you also see it in stuff like they're bringing out police more often. They have police that spoke at the DNC. They waved the flag. They talked about the military a lot. Kamala Harris made a bunch of leftist commentators very mad and perplexed when she said some line that was like, we need to have the most lethal military force in the world. And again, you know, for a Democrat to say that is absolutely pivoting to the center. And so I think you see a lot of pivoting to the center in that kind of stuff. You know, like Kamala Harris did not say the word black in her acceptance speech. I believe she made zero mention of race or like LGBT issues, essentially, except that she said her mother was like a fierce, small brown woman, and it was referring to her mom. But other than that, I think her entire acceptance speech basically had no race or sex, gender identity stuff. Not that she's stopped believing that, you know, in kind of the core democratic ideas, but she's pivoted hard away from like the idea that we need to center that. So that's one way that you definitely see Democrats moderating. And anybody watching the DNC, anybody watching the speech would have kind of instinctually understood that Kamala has changed that. She's moving to the center in that direction. In terms of economic policy, though, I think it's going to be a little trickier. I think this is going to be one of those things where my expectation is that if Kamala wins in November and begins her administration, she's kind of going to do the party management thing of she's just going to try to keep all the camps happy. It's best to think of her like a machine politician rather than an ideologue. She's going to throw things to the YIMBY crowd because the YIMBYs have, in a very short period of time, have become this massive voice, and they're too big to be ignored now. So there's going to be a lot of pro-housing stuff, but there's also going to be a lot of the other stuff too. You know, I'm not a fan of it, but the price gouging stuff, it polls really well. It polls really well to be like, we're going to go after price gougers. So she's probably going to see that there's not a lot of harm in doing it. I think the role of groups like mine and groups like yours potentially is that to try to make sure that if she does that, it's mostly a token effort that doesn't actually, you know, screw up the economy too much. So I think that, you know, if she wins, I would expect her to engage in economic policy and essentially just managing the groups, managing the progressives, managing the abundance crowd, trying to give everybody a little bit of what they want without alienating anybody too much. That's kind of the mainline approach that I would expect from her.
I think, Jeremiah, I kind of picture her driving into the DNC in a limo over the bodies of economists, you know, just screaming and crying about how they're the only ones who nobody pays attention to or cares about anymore. I mean, it seems like if what you're saying is true, neither party now it really cares about economics. I mean, if anything, the Republicans are possibly going to have even higher deficits and all this kind of thing. Do you think at any point, if Kamala gets elected, at any point in her administration, she's going to stop just doing these handouts and like somehow the deficit questions, the, you know, stop kicking the can down the road stuff is actually going to catch up with her? Or is this just something that both parties are just going to keep kicking, you know, until some horrible situation happens to the whole country?
I would kind of dispute that neither party cares about economics. And look, you take it with a grain of salt. I am a partisan Democrat, so judge me by that standard. I'm going to give the Democratic line. But you know, recognizing that Bernie Sanders sucks and doesn't know anything, Bernie Sanders is also not the center of the Democratic Party. And if you do compare the two platforms to see, you know, which one has more good ideas, which one has fewer bad ideas, I do think the Democrats pretty clearly win. That the worst economic idea on the table this time around from either party is Trump's tariff plan to put a 10% tariff on everything. That is unspeakably horrible. The second worst idea is Trump's plan for mass deportation, which some people look at immigration as a social issue, but it's also a horrifying economic idea to deport millions of people. It'd probably instantly send us into recession. And you can kind of just go down the list. All of Trump's core ideas are terrible, and he would populate, You know, his economic team would be filled with cranks who don't even have economic degrees. You're talking about people like Stephen Moore. He would undermine the independence of the Federal Reserve. You know, he wants to put lackeys on the Federal Reserve who will just raise lower interest rates when he tells them to. Whereas, you know, Democrats still appoint like really, really prestigious econ PhDs from mainline institutions like MIT and Harvard and Chicago. That's who's on Democratic, you know, Council of Economic Advisors. And yeah, I don't love every single idea that comes out of Democratic plans, but Democrats are dedicated to building more homes. But we're pretty unified around that. While Trump is pandering to NIMBYism and saying they're gonna nuke your suburbs. You know, I'm gonna protect your suburbs. I'm not gonna let them build anything. Like on just issue after issue, I do think the Democrats have the right ideas. And yeah, they're not all the right ideas, but they're the majority of the good ideas that will be proposed in this election are coming from Democrats. Whether it's, you know, there's big portions of the party that want to do things like permitting reform, like occupational licensing reform, like building more homes, like building more nuclear energy, you know, kind of all this stuff that we could go down the line and talk about. I'm by and large, I think the Democrats would improve the economy, and especially as compared to what would happen, you know, if Trump gets elected.
And
It's funny. I
go for it.
I was gonna say real quick. I totally agree with you on a lot of those points, but the YIMBY part, it actually scares me a little bit. I almost want to go back to the days when the YIMBY stuff would look like a very bipartisan issue, because now that it's being taken, the mantle of it is being taken up by at least some elements of the Democratic Party very directly. I feel like it's going to become one of these culture war things, and then the Republicans now have to be against it. All of that just kind of worries me, especially if we end up with a Republican administration.
Yeah, two thoughts there, just to cap that point. The first thought is that Democrats are the only ones who matter, because out of our top 45 or 50 biggest cities, how many of them have Republican governments? You know, one,
Yeah.
maybe. So in all of our biggest cities, especially the top 10 where the housing crisis is the most acute, we're talking about it's all Democrats you have to convince. So that's point one. Point two is that if we can defeat Trump this time, look, maybe he'll be back for 2028. I have no idea. But I tend to think that if he loses this time, having lost twice in a row, that the Republican Party will have to break from Trumpism. And it's up in the air, like what comes after Trumpism? How do they, a lot of them are going to try to do Trumpism without Trump, but that break will probably provide, hopefully, an opportunity for them to embrace some sort of you know, more rational economic message again that could include, you know, building homes is good. So I think if we can beat Trump, that some of that fever will break, because it really is just a Trump line, pretty much, that like they're going to destroy your suburbs. Like I don't see I don't see Mitch McConnell saying that. I don't see Mike Johnson. Paul Ryan never said that. Like there's very few other like important national figures who go hard on that angle the way that Trump does.
Well, Heritage I saw put out, and I can't remember exactly what document this was in, but they'd put out the defense of the single family zoning as like one of their top priorities. And so I think that's on the horizon, whether we like it or not, right? At least part of the conservative set of values.
Heritage has just sold their soul. They'll do anything for money. So, you know, if the political winds shift, they'll shift too. I don't believe they actually have any principles.
Same. Okay, so let's talk about the political wins, because that I think is where you sit in the picture with CNL. I think that's kind of what we're trying to do as well. So you've obviously positioned CNL as kind of a pro-abundance organization. One of the things that I see the work that you guys are doing is basically trying to win these kind of conversations within the Democratic Party to pull them towards economic sanity, which is an incredibly important goal. And our goal is very similar as well. We want to kind of build this broader movement across both parties that it can influence things in a more kind of economically liberal and socially liberal direction. So, you know, do you maybe want to go through the differences between what might be a more liberal economic agenda versus a progressive agenda? I mean, you had mentioned price gouging. So I don't know if maybe you want to talk just briefly about this kind of price gouging proposal, why it's broken, why it's wrong. Maybe we can start there.
I mean, sure. Yeah, I'm not like an expert on price gouging
For sure.
policy, but I think that there's kind of there's a couple of progressive instincts that I think really separate them from liberals. And you know, these are the people who, by and large, are in my camp. So I spend a lot of time yelling at them to be better, despite the fact that they're on my team. It's one of those things, you know, the narcissism of small differences. I yell at them more. I yell at the left almost more than I yell at the right online because I expect better from them sometimes. But with price gouging, I think there's a real there's an instinct on the political left that every bad thing in the world is caused by a nefarious right-leaning power. And usually that is in the form of capitalism as a grand system, or a billionaire, or corporations. And so you'll see Bernie Sanders, you know, rail against billionaires. It's one of his applause lines. The 1%. Elizabeth Warren will go after giant corporations. And there's kind of this idea that there's always a boogeyman who's behind the problem. And to be fair, there are times when, yes, the problem is that there's literally a big corporation that screwed some people over. Like, that's a thing that has happened many times in the past, right? And it would be dumb to ignore that. But it's not the cause of all of our problems. And you know, when you talk about like price gouging, when I don't know, when a blizzard hits and there's only, you know, 3 generators left at the Home Depot, you know, that's nobody did that. There's no billionaire that's behind that. That's a natural thing that happened. A blizzard happened, and now we're in a situation. And you know, the economic response, the economist would say, well, look, you have a couple ways. You have a scarce good, and there's a couple ways to ration it. You could just do it randomly, first come, first serve, and keep the price the same. And maybe there's some merit to that, right? Or you could price discriminate and raise the price a lot, and it would tend to go to whoever actually has the most use for it, rather than just the first person who happens to show up. You can debate this back and forth, but the progressive instinct is more to deny that trade-offs exist and to be like, well, all that's really happening is some capitalist billionaire who wants to take advantage of you and raise prices. And that's, you know, I don't find that instinct particularly useful. In a broader sense, though, I think there's something that's even more insidious than that, because I tend to think the price gouging stuff is very small potatoes. They're going to propose something and it's not actually going to matter very much. It's going to be one of those pieces of legislation that people fight over, and the practical impact is very small. But I think the bigger thing that happens in progressive circles that they really have to come to terms with, and an area I actually think we can convince them is the progressive love of process over results. And I wrote a piece about this a while back, I think last year, where I said, you know, American progressives are really becoming processives because they care about the process more than they care about getting things done. They care about holding community input meetings and making sure lots of bureaucratic boxes are checked, doing a lot of reviews, doing environmental reviews, doing, you know, just making sure that we've got the right check marks from the Department of Education and the Department of Indian Affairs and the Department of Energy, and just like there's almost this attitude of more process and more bureaucracy can never be a bad thing. You know, we want to build a new solar plant, you know, near our town, better have 20 sessions of community input, and, you know, make sure that the historical preservation people are notified so they can have their input, and make sure that we do an environmental review, because what if there's an endangered mole rat that lives on those grounds? And like, it's just, there's this kind of like almost just pervasive need to do any and all kind of process that is strangling American enterprise. And that, I think, is becoming more and more recognized. And I think is somewhere that we can actually win, is convincing progressives, look, you don't need to care about the process. You don't need to care about the paperwork. You don't need to care about how many meetings you've had. You should care about getting the thing done. You know, if you want people to trust big government, if you want these big grand spending programs, fine, but prove that we're getting something out of it.
It's better for the poor when you can, again, to the housing conversation, if you can develop and build and lower costs. You know, one of the things that I find interesting is, on the kind of extremes, there is every human being has this desire for silver bullet solutions. Like, everyone's looking for a single answer, but this whole left instinct to blame, say, billionaires is very, very similar to the far right instinct to blame immigrants. It's just this idea that every single problem in society can be blamed on this one group, and if only we just go after this one group, we'll solve it. When in reality, I think the thing that unites liberals is kind of an understanding that incentives are the things that need to be addressed, and that's a much more nuanced conversation. It's not as easy to get 1,000 likes on, thousands of likes for something like that, because there's so much nuance to unpack. Max, you want to take this next one?
Yeah, I just had a quick question though, Jeremiah. You're talking a lot about changing hearts and minds, or at least what people want to do within the Democratic Party. How do you do that? Like, how do you do it on a practical level? Is that through tweets and Substack? But like, how does somebody like you, how do people have this kind of impact to change the overall regulatory command and control perspective of some of those stronger progressives? Or is it just a matter of like sidelining and quieting down those elements of the Democratic Party and raising up other elements?
It's a little bit of everything, and that's a frustrating answer, but I think it's the correct answer. I will say that the tweeting and the social media stuff, as much as you can make fun of it, does matter, at least to some extent. People used to say 10 years ago, the internet is not real life. Yeah, this person is loud on the internet, but that's not real life. And I don't think you can say that anymore. The conversations that start on weird parts of Twitter and TikTok can now actually metastasize and grow and become part of the national conversation. And YIMBYism was a weird fringe belief 7 or 8 years ago, and is now part of the national conversation. And Barack Obama is saying in his speech at the DNC, not just that we have to build homes, but that we also have to tear down the regulations that are stopping us from doing that. By the way, I had a moment. I had like a religious moment when that happened. I was in the box. I was in at the DNC there when Obama said that. And like I've never really identified with the I don't know, like you see those poor teenage girls at like Taylor Swift concerts who are literally losing their mind out of having an out of body experience because Taylor Swift has come on stage. I never really identified with that. I didn't get it until Obama said we need to tear down the regulations that stop us from building more homes. And then I got it. But so the process matters, and yeah, it matters that there's a lot of people out there arguing and tweeting, and then beyond that, doing the work of showing up at local city council meetings, at city governments, at zoning commissions, having meetings with your elected representatives, both publicly and behind the scenes. It's a long, slow grind to actually change people's views, and I mean, it's kind of like saying like, well, how did the public go from 15% approval of gay marriage to a decade later they were like 60 or 70% approval of gay marriage? That happened very fast, and there's no one way it happened. It was the media, it was seeing gay relationships on television, it was just talking to people and getting to know people, lots of conversations on the internet, but lots of real world stuff too, lots of quiet conversations behind doors. Like, it's all of the above, but there is real movement, especially on the YIMBY front, especially on the home buying front. You can actually break through and convince people, and I think you see this in like Ezra Klein is a great example of this, where Ezra's pretty lefty. Ezra's like very like social democrat-y, like not a socialist, but like pretty far down the social democrat line of like, he really sympathetic to Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, and he's definitely more left than I am, is just to make the point. but he is all aboard. He's one of the loudest cheerleaders for like what he calls supply side progressivism or supply side liberalism, because he wants things to actually get done. He wants lots of government spending, but he wants it to actually do something. You know, when they spend money on infrastructure, are we going to get delays and paperwork and most of that money going down the hole, you know, down the drain? Or are we actually going to get a lot of ports and roads and dams and bridges and things like that? You know, I think you can win that conversation, and I think we are winning that conversation. Some of the other stuff, like should we have really strict antitrust policy and break up some big companies? Should we pass, you know, price gouging laws? That I think is a harder political fight. But in terms of just reducing the amount of process, whether that's environmental reviews, whether that's the zoning and the community input hearings that you have to have before you can build an apartment building, whether that's, you know, you need to have 2,500 hours of training before you can be licensed as a cosmetician. Like, I think we can actually win that conversation, and that's one I'm really optimistic about.
I think this might be a good place to pivot to maybe some of the intellectual or political leaders that might excite you. You know, there is one amazing governor that I think we all have a great amount of respect for, in Jared Polis from Colorado. And I'm aware of this thing called the New Democrat Caucus, and I know that there's a lot of movement around this abundance agenda in the Democratic Party. Are there any individuals or politicians or people that you would say these guys get it, and these guys are on our
Yeah.
team?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of really cool new Democrats. Jared Polis is obviously probably my favorite politician in the country. I've told him directly that if he ever runs for president, I'm quitting my job and working for his campaign. But there's a lot of new Democrats, like Scott Peters is one of the what do you call it, the co-sponsors of the YIMBY Act. Michael Bennett is another example, also from Colorado. In general, the Colorado Democrats seem to be really, really good, whether it's Bennett, Hickenlooper, Polis, whether it's Brittany Pedersen, Neguse. Like all of the Colorado Democrats are really amazing. So, you know, I would look at some of the, just go to some of the bills that are actually really good. Go to the Build More Housing Near Transit Act. Go to the YIMBY Act. Go to the Big Wires Act, which I think that might be, oh, I'm going to get it wrong. I think it might be Derek Kilmer is one of the sponsors. I could be wrong there, but Kilmer's great. But there's all these kind of big efforts that are trying, you know, and Democrats are trying to get bipartisan support for them. These are all about, you know, the Big Wires Act is about building more transmission lines, because if, you know, climate change is real and we've got to build a bunch of green energy to solve it, but that's not going to happen. You know, that won't matter unless we can actually increase the transmission across the country. We've got to transmit all that green energy from where it's produced to where it's needed. And currently it's really difficult because of all these regulatory hurdles, all these environmental reviews. It's really, really difficult to actually build new transmission lines. So the Big Wires Act is great. There's all these efforts, and I would just go find who the sponsors of those bills are. You know, do just a little bit of research, and you'll see who's out there fighting. And there's dozens of members of the New Democrat Coalition who are out there. If I was going to highlight one person at a local level, Scott Wiener would be an interesting example. And actually, Scott is more like Ezra Klein, in that Scott Wiener is actually like pretty lefty, pretty you know, he's a state senator from California. He's from the San Francisco area, and because he's San Francisco, he's pretty far to the left in a lot of ways. But like, he has been fully YIMBY pilled. He has been fully, you know, embraced the idea that like the government is getting in the way of building, you know, a housing, and we've got to allow people to build more housing. And then he's just pretty far to the left on everything else. But like, stuff like that is part of the reason that I'm optimistic here.
I am curious. I wanted to ask one more question before I hand it off to Max, and then we maybe go to Q&A. Obviously, you know, our goal is to try to find advocates for these values wherever they might be. And so we one of the things I found when I really started getting into the weeds on looking at the lawmakers that were aligned, I found there were an incredible amount of people on the center left that were the biggest advocates. It's not a surprise to anyone. But is there anyone in the Republican side at all that you think understands these things? I mean, like I think I want to say Phil Scott maybe comes to mind, like from Vermont. I'm not sure. I'm not curious as to whether there's anybody in the GOP that you go, well, that guy probably gets this stuff as well. That's not a crazy MAGA person.
Let me hold on. There was one guy who I really liked, and I don't even think he's in office anymore. But let me try to remember his name. Kevin Faulconer was the mayor of San Diego. He at the time he's no longer the mayor of San Diego. I think he was the mayor like 2012 to 2020 or something like that. And he was really interesting. He was a Republican mayor, one of the few Republican mayors of like a top 10, top 15 city in America, because San Diego is a big city. And he was a really interesting Republican in that he was reasonably pro LGBT. He was not anti-immigration. He was pretty YIMBY. So he was just kind of like a classic Rockefeller Republican, almost just like a pro-business Republican who didn't really want to get in anybody's way otherwise. And I remember really, really admiring kind of what he did in San Diego. He's not. I don't think he's doing anything anymore. I don't think he's still in politics, or if he is, it's something that I don't know. But no, I'm trying to think at the national level. Like, I mean, look, I'm always willing to work with the Republicans if you can get some. The only way to get stuff through Congress is to at least get a couple Republicans on board, right? Things don't pass unless they're bipartisan. Even if Democrats somehow control the Senate and the House after this election, you're still going to have to deal with the filibuster. So I'm willing to work with Republicans. There's Republicans that are doing things I like on the child tax credit, for instance, but by and large, I do think the Democratic Party has the better energy here. When you talk about permitting reform, a lot of times all Republicans will want to talk about is like oil and gas, which like you can make an argument for that, I suppose, but if that's all you care about, then it's going to be suspect to everybody else.
Max, you got any questions before we do Q&A?
Yeah, I got one quick question. Assuming that Democratic Party wins in November, nobody likes making too hard of a prediction, but do you foresee that the wing of the Democratic Party that you more closely associate with is going to end up being ascendant relative to that other wing? And obviously that's what you're working towards. But do you foresee that that's going to be happening within the coming 4 years? Or do you think that that's a much longer struggle over the course of, the next decade or more?
I guess it depends on what you mean by ascendant. Ascendant in terms of like our ideas triumph and the other ideas are sent to go cry in a corner and weep bitter tears and gnash their teeth, and that's not going to happen, right? They're still going to maintain a lot of energy. They're still going to maintain a lot of enthusiasm. They're still going to have a lot of people behind them. But in terms of actual policy, yeah, we're going to be ascendant. We're going to be the ones that matter. And the reason is because let's say that Democrats win the presidency. Let's say that Kamala Harris wins. And let's say that we have a really good election and we take back the House, which is, it's not far-fetched for the Democrats to take back the House. Let's say we have a really good election and we maintain the Senate, which is, it would have to be a really good election for us to keep the Senate. But even if we do all that stuff, that's a 50-50 Senate. That's, Democrats might have a 5 to 10 seat majority in the House. So, who are the swing votes? In a practical sense, what is getting implemented, what is getting passed out of those chambers? Well, unless John Tester likes it, it's not going to pass. Unless Michael Bennet and John Hickenlooper like it, it's not going to pass the Senate. There's a lot of moderate senators who are going to have their say, and Bernie Sanders can want whatever he wants, But if it doesn't pass the moderate senators, it's not going to fly. And the same thing in the House. The AOC and the members of the squad can like whatever they like, and it's fine for them to do that. But the New Democrat coalition are the swing votes. They are the ones who actually matter. They are the middle. And so they're the ones who are going to have the last say on what can actually pass out of the House. So I'm, in the dream world where Democrats actually get control of all three, you're going to see that the New Democrats have a lot of power in Washington because they're the swing votes. They get to decide, especially in like a 50-50 Senate.
Just to tighten that up real quick, there are a lot of liberals from the Libertarian Party who are now no longer in the Libertarian Party, and a lot of I think people who would be liberal conservatives who now don't feel like they have a home in the Republican Party. Do you feel like they will find a home, many of them, in the Democratic Party, assuming Kamala Harris wins?
I hope so, and I'm working actively to make sure that that's a real possibility. I want that to be a possibility. I want the Democratic Party to be a big tent party where lots of different perspectives are welcomed, and that's my pitch. Is that, look, you have an enormous amount of power as a moderate Democrat. When Democrats are in power, it's moderate Democrats who decide what policy actually gets passed. Elizabeth Warren can propose some price gouging thing that says we're going to break up all the big grocery stores and we're going to fine you $1 billion if you raise your prices on tomatoes and all that. But that's not going to fly. Nobody's going to vote for that except for her and 5 members of the squad and a couple other people. I don't know. What could get passed is some like very narrow thing that won't have any impact, and then they move on to the stuff they actually care about, that the moderates are willing to go all in on, which is like housing policy, build a lot more houses, get rid of zoning regulations, and there's only so much you can do at a federal level with housing, so maybe that's not the best example, but you really can have a lot of power as a moderate Democrat. And the Democrats, this has historically been the case as well. Back when Democrats from like the 60s to the 90s had almost universal control of the House, it was a bunch of blue dogs. It was conservative Southern Democrats who really were the decision makers and really the rainmakers in Congress. There's a long history of this being the case.
Definitely going to be an interesting year, or I should say decade, to watch as this plays out. I want to go to Q&A if we can before we run out of time.
It feels like the last year has been a decade.
It actually does. I want to say, what has it been, like a little bit over a month since Joe Biden dropped out, and it feels like it feels like an eternity. Absolute eternity.
I've got my just for everybody right here, I've got my two.
They are present and represented.
My boy.
All right, well, let's
happy to take some questions.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do some Q&A. Let me start reading through these, and maybe Max, you're welcome to swap. I'm gonna go back and forth here. So, first question from James Gonzalez: How are humanism and liberalism related? At what point in human history do we recognize our common humanity create such a concept as humankind? I don't know if you want to riff off that question, whether you've got any thoughts on that, Jeremiah, just the concept of the relation between humanism and liberalism.
I have to plead ignorance here. I don't have any great knowledge of humanistic philosophy other than kind of the Wikipedia level basics. So, I suspect that they're relatively related. Liberalism obviously centers the individual to a great extent, and you can exaggerate how much that's the case, but the idea of the individual as having primacy, and the humanity as being something to be celebrated, inherently good, and every individual is born with specific rights that will allow them to flourish. I think those are core liberal ideas that are related to humanism, but I don't feel qualified to give much more than a summary answer there, unfortunately.
I think that's a good response. I also have Philip from Spectacles, who you might be familiar with. He said, it's good to see you. I like your quote, liberalism as an alternative to violence formulation. What do you make of Trump's campaign slogan, fight, fight, fight? Was the first part of that question.
I mean, it's terrifying. Look, it's obviously in normal circumstances, it would be just a little bit eye roll, like the politician tells his supporters to fight. But this is a guy who's, told his supporters to march on the Capitol, and then they tried to overturn the results of an election. And look, sometimes people downplay that. They're like, "Oh, well, it was never going to happen." And look, nobody ever thinks these things are going to happen until they happen. There's a great anecdote from a historian, and I can't remember his name, but it's a historian who talks about Italy, and kind of Mussolini was kind of viewed as a joke for a long time. Mussolini was a joke, and he was just this dumb guy, and he got this rabble together, and they kind of did a March on Rome thing, and everybody just looked at it and thought, this is ridiculous. March on Rome, bunch of peasants with sticks, half of them literally just walking down the road with like a club or a stick, and it was viewed as ridiculous. The army could easily defeat these guys. Just all they've got to do is fire on them, and it was ridiculous right up to the moment that it wasn't, and it worked. So I don't understand people who try to downplay January 6th and the implications of that. That like they were 50 feet away from Nancy Pelosi. What do you think would have happened if they had actually caught up to her? If things had gone just a little bit differently that day? So it's terrifying. What do I think of it? Donald Trump is a horrifying authoritarian who, if he is given the chance, would happily seize authoritarian power, and will take every liberty he's able to take for himself. That seems pretty plainly obvious to me.
Max, maybe I can tee you up for this one. This is the second part of Philip's question. We discussed earlier that the convergence of the far left and the far right. The question from Philip is, where do you see a similar inclination to violence among leaders on the left? Or is this an issue relegated to the fringes rather than maybe the broader left? Curious, Max, you're welcome to chime in on that. I've got some thoughts on that one too.
Yeah, I have some quick thoughts on that, which is, of course, if you look at the left more broadly than just the left in the United States, we see, just look at Venezuela, right? That's the kind of inclination to violence among the left is, but thankfully, I think, aside from maybe the stuff that was going on during like the BLM riots, when there was maybe not enough of a pressure from a lot of Democratic mayors and governors to push against the kind of stuff we were seeing, right? We all remember like the mostly peaceful protests where it's like, well, mostly peaceful, I'm not so sure about that. Other than that, though, I think we haven't seen a lot of political violence coming, at least from leadership on the left, which is good. I think good, hopefully the kind of political violence we see from the left in other parts of the world doesn't somehow end up bleeding over into the United States. But maybe you guys have some other thoughts on that.
I think there's an interesting sense in which the left is not really socialist in America these days, at least not all of it. A lot of it is anarchist. A lot of the left is like, don't tell me what to do ism. Like the principle of don't boss me around as an ism, as an ideology. And that's the part of the left. It's not the Bernie Sanders who, is kind of approving of riots on Twitter, but it's like the anarchist left that just says, screw the system, screw the man, screw everything, screw the government, screw society. Like there's a large part of the left that is really no longer socialist. They're no longer actually about building institutions, where at least the Soviet Union tried to build stuff. At least they had a bunch of steel plants. I'm not a fan of the Soviet Union, but at least they were trying. There's a large part of the left that doesn't even want to do that. It's more like burn it all to the ground. And I think that's kind of what you see there, is just the dirtbag internet Chapo style left is really anarchist rather than socialist in their inclinations. And that is not a feature that you see in like Bernie Sanders or AOC or whatever. So I think it's very much a more diffuse phenomenon, rather, like you said, rather than the leadership of the left.
Yeah, and I couldn't. Yeah, I couldn't even add on that to add any extra value. It's definitely something that is at least political violence being embraced at the leadership level. Something we're seeing on the right and not on the left right now. Is the cohesion we see currently growing in the Democratic Party between liberals and progressives just a result of the fear of Trump, or is there something more substantive to that alliance? What do you think, Jeremiah?
I mean, it's a lot of it. Is a lot of it is the fear of Trump. I don't even think that Republicans have fully realized how much of the Kamala unity that we've seen, how everybody's just posting coconut memes and how Tim Walz is your Midwestern dad kind of stuff, like how much of that is just driven by we are determined to beat Trump. But it's possible to overstate that. There's a lot of overlap between liberals and progressives in terms of social liberalism, in terms of protecting LGBT rights, in terms of treating immigrants like humans. There's kind of all these different areas that are not just tax and regulation policy. There's a lot more to politics. Even as like a reformed econ major, I will have to admit there's a lot of things in politics other than just tax and regulation policy. So on a lot of those areas, you're going to see liberal and progressives overlap pretty well.
That question was from Ty Wyman, so thanks for the question, Ty. I'm going to move a little bit faster through these because I know we've kept you at a full hour now. So, Jeremiah, if you need a rush, let me know. But a couple more on this front. Question from Philip again. Do you think the DNC's pivot to the center could be motivated by the seeming collapse of the GOP, spying a larger opportunity at the right margins rather than the left? He says, in a vacuum, I tend to think the extremists tend to win out in alliances between pragmatists and extremists, as pragmatists are frequently more willing to compromise. Curious as to your thoughts on that one.
You think the pivot to the center has sometimes more to do with just look, there's that aspect of electoral realism, that there's more votes to be had picking up disaffected Republicans and independents than there are, in kind of trying to placate the far left. Because no matter to some extent, no matter what you do for the far left, they're always going to find a reason to hate you. They're always going to find a reason that you are not pure enough. You gave them Medicare for all, but you didn't do this, you didn't raise the minimum wage, or you gave them Medicare for all and you're pledged to raise the minimum wage, but you haven't said the right thing about Gaza. There's always going to be some leftist will create a permission structure to not vote for you. And I think there's just kind of a recognition like, I don't have time to play that game, so I'm going to go where the votes are, which is in the center. And parties, there's very strong evidence in political science and in kind of the academic field of political science and the research that's been done. Parties are rewarded for moderating. Now, it's funny, moderating for Republicans looks like kind of populist economics, that they're willing to spend on welfare programs. They become more populist. That's what it looks like to be a Republican, to kind of moderate. For Democrats, it means being more pro-business and pivoting to the center. That's how Democrats moderate. And so I think that's part of it. I also just think there's part of it where, again, I view Kamala Harris as a machine politician. And the way that the far left has worked for a long time is that they've actually gained influence from being disruptive. They disrupt things and they yell at you and they demand for you to sign on to all their stuff. And because they do that, they actually get more influential because they get to set the demands. And generally politicians, a lot of them will fold to these demands. And what kind of Kamala Harris has changed is she's saying, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm not there. It's not this thing anymore where you make a bunch of demands and then I, hurry up and please you, and then maybe you will vote for me. Now, how it's going to work is you're going to vote for me and you're going to support me and you're going to like it. And then maybe after you've proven that you support me, maybe I will do something for you. That's how the machine politician works. That's how a boss works in a political machine, is that first comes the support. And then afterwards, favors get doled out. And you can kind of see this with like the whole issue at the DNC of like, should there be a Palestinian speaker or not? It became a big thing on social media. And I'm not going to speak to whether that was a good idea or not. I'm not saying anything about the relative suffering of the Palestinian people or whether there should or should not be or whatever. But what I'm going to just note is that that's a crowd of people that has actively disrupted Kamala Harris's rallies. That some of them hold signs outside the DNC saying "Killer Kamala," and she's just not going to reward that. That's not what a machine politician does. You don't reward bad behavior; you ice them out. So that I think that's kind of how another way in which I understand the pivot to the center is that if the leftist groups aren't going to get on board, then they're not going to have a place at the table. And that's you can say what you want about that. Maybe you love machine politics, maybe you don't, but it's a quicker way to deal with disruptive protesters than what Democrats have been doing before.
The next question from Tommy, it actually touches on this, and you may say ditto on this one. Basically, what do you say to the non-Democrat liberals that feel frustrated within the liberal elements of the DNC? People maybe like former libertarians that are not ready to pull the trigger, or former Republicans.
Look, I agree. I'm frustrated with illiberal elements in the Democratic Party as well. But look, I think that the Democratic Party is in flux right now and can be influenced. If you are looking for a place to exercise influence, one of the things that I talk about a lot is that activism is not like a social club. Activism is not having the right beliefs. I don't give a crap if you have the right beliefs. I want to know how you are changing the world. How will the actions you take actually make a difference in the world? What is the causal pathway there? What are you doing? What impact is it going to have? So if you believe that there are illiberal elements in society, and you probably believe that they exist, some of them in the Democratic Party, some of them in the Republican Party, the question you should be asking is, how can I impact that? And my answer to that is, I think there's a really good chance right now in the Democratic Party to make a difference, that the Democratic Party is able to be swayed and able to be made more liberal. And so if your goal as a political personality or an activist or an organizer or just a person is to make society more liberal, I think one of the best ways you can do that right now is to make the Democratic Party more liberal. That this is a fight you should care about because it's winnable. Not in its entirety. No political party is ever going to be perfect, but this is something that you can have a real difference on. So, you're going to be in the same party as a bunch as illiberal people like Bernie Sanders. Suck it up and do it anyways, because that's where you can make a difference. That's the actual impact you can have. It's not about having the right belief. It's not about hanging out with people who are very pure. It's about what you did and what difference it made. That's my pitch.
Same way. So we only have 4 more questions. I'm going to paraphrase the next one from Philip. He basically pointed to this idea of the Democrats embracing YIMBYism as kind of disjointed from reality. And he pointed to the fact that a lot of red cities typically have done the best job of managing cost of living increases and building more housing. Do you think it's an out of touch question? Like, how do you address that dynamic? Because I live in Tennessee, for example. We have a ton of development here, a ton of people moving here from blue states, mainly due to the fact that there's a lot more development, lower cost of living. Curious as to how you address that dichotomy.
Yeah, so this is a point in time versus a change, right? This is the calculus of what is actually like, what is the rate of change versus where are we now? Red states right now, it's easier to build. In Georgia, in Texas, and I don't know about Tennessee, but it sounds like Tennessee, it's easier to build in those places. But the places where it's most important to build are in our most productive cities. And that is New York, Chicago, LA, San Francisco, Seattle, the biggest cities that have the biggest companies, that have the most productive workers, have the highest GDP. Those are the cities that are really suffering from, they have so much productive potential, that people want to move to New York, people want to move to San Francisco, and they're not. So I agree with you that at the point in time we are at right now, Republican-held states are often easier to build in. But I would point at the change in direction, the velocity of where we're going, is that Democrats are rapidly becoming more YIMBY. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and President Barack Obama all in the past week have had statements, in past 2 weeks, I guess, have had statements about how we need to build millions more homes. And that kind of thing does filter down into state level representatives and local city council members. When the leaders of a party say that kind of thing, that filters down, that has an effect. And Democrats are certainly better on this than they were. They're better on this than they were, a year ago, 3 years ago, 7 years ago. So that's what's encouraging to me, is to see the direction of change, which is going in a very positive direction. And it's also the fight that we have to win, because look, there's a future where the YIMBYism just doesn't win out, and New York and San Francisco remain frozen in time, and they don't build any more housing, and everybody moves to red states as a result. But I don't think that's a win. I don't think that's a good thing, because all you're doing is reducing the kind of power of agglomerations that we have in our biggest cities. San Francisco is a miracle of a city. You know how many of the top 50 companies in the world have been born out of that one city? It's like potentially more than half, maybe. It's an absurd number. Like the amount of technologies and companies that have come out of that one city. And think about what we are missing if we just say, well, somebody who would have gone to San Francisco to start a company ended up just moving to Nashville instead, and instead is now like a manager in a regional bank or something. That sounds like a win because they've got cheaper housing, but it's not actually a win. We need San Francisco to double its population, and how many more ridiculous innovations will come from that? Like it, there's not, you can't just replace San Francisco. You can try, but it it's kind of like you're destroying the magic when you do that. So I
That's
think it's
actually
really important that Democrats do that.
that's something I've actually never thought about. It's an interesting way to put it, because there's these established industries and there's all these professionals in the same space. Keeping them there makes a lot of sense. I'm going to ask a related question, and then I'm going to paraphrase two questions in one, and we'll get out of here. Sanchin was asking, he said, I have a far leftist friend that once told me YIMBYism is just trickled down Reaganomics. Is he wrong?
Yes, he's wrong. I mean, look, I think that trickle down Reaganomics is a thing. People use that in 100 different ways. I don't even know how to define it, but it's just the basic recognition of reality. If people want to move to your city, if New York is a really desirable place to live, and if there's way more people than there are units, the price is going to go up. That's I don't even think it's anti-leftist to say that. Like you can be a full tanky USSR Soviet and think that's horrible, but still recognize that it's true. Maybe if you're a Soviet, you think it should be all public housing, but you can still recognize the basic fact that we need more of it. That supply and demand are still real things, even if you think capitalism is bullshit. That to some degree, this is just like weird cope about like the fact that supply and demand don't exist or something like that.
All right, last question. It's kind of a two-parter from James. He was talking earlier about this lip service. He basically said, is a recommended strategy for liberal candidates to win elections now basically paying lip service to populist economics and then basically pulling a bait and switch? That was the first part. And, curious as to whether or not you think that's coming, or whether you have any commentary on that before I go to the second part.
I mean, yes, it's somewhat of a bait and switch, and it's bad in theory. I don't think it's immediately bad, because I don't think price gouging stuff could even pass, but it sets it up like you talk about it this election, and it obviously can't pass, so it goes nowhere. But then maybe 8 years from now, it's been talked about so long that people are actually ready to pass it. Like that kind of thing happens sometimes. And in that sense, it's bad. But like this is also like, I don't want to be too cynical about politics, but like every politician overpromises. Everybody says they're gonna, the classic line is, I'm gonna cut your taxes, and I'm gonna increase spending, and I'm gonna balance the budget. And like to some extent, we tolerate this out of politicians. We don't want them to lie to us like an extraordinary amount, but we all accept they're gonna lie a little bit. And just that's how it works. That's the world. That's how it works. It would be better if nobody lied ever, but that's not how things go. So, yes, it is essentially undermining public trust a little bit, and public trust is pretty low these days. But it's one of those things where, done within a certain parameter of reasonableness, you can kind of put up with it. And it's just the nature of politics. Every political party, every politician does this. Everybody promises big things and then kind of backs off of them, like the nature of the game.
Well, you've actually addressed the second part of his question, so I'll leave it there. I'll speak to the audience briefly, and then we can close us out. First of all, I appreciate everyone for listening in and taking time out of your day. And for those of you in the chat that are also supporters and members of Project Liberal, great appreciation for all the support you've given the project. Jeremiah, do you have anything to plug before I take us out?
Sure. Yeah, I founded the Center for New Liberalism. We are a group of center-left liberals. We have chapters in 60 or 70 cities across the country. If you're interested in joining CNL, you can do it at cnliberalism.org. See if you have a local chapter near you. I also host the New Liberal podcast, which is part of CNL. And I write at infinitescroll.us on both politics and kind of technology and the social internet. So check out Infinite Scroll. And just want to say again, I really hope that Project Liberal catches on, and that I think the work you guys are trying to do is very good, and that we need more of it.
Awesome. Great appreciation for your time, Jeremiah. Thank you again. And also thank you, Max, for co-hosting and making this an awesome, smooth first webinar. For the audience, if you're interested in supporting Project Liberal and becoming a member, you can go to projectliberal.org/member and contribute financially. You'll get a series of perks, behind the scenes updates, vote for our steering committee, and a lot of other things. And you can always reach out to me at josh@projectliberal.org, or reach out to the team at info@projectliberal.org. But check out our website if you want to get more involved. At projectliberal.org/volunteer, you can take some steps to step up and join our team. But thank you all three. Everyone have a wonderful afternoon and a wonderful week. And let's hope for a more liberal future. Have a great day, guys.